Awesome. Well, thanks a lot for having me, and thanks everyone for your time and attention, paying attention to me as I talk about this. The subject of library socialism, it's something. Library socialism is basically it's a vision, it's a counter hegemonic vision for an alternative future. One of the ways that neoliberalism has succeeded is by limiting the frontiers of our imagination. I think it's one of the reasons that a conference like this is such an awesome idea. And one of the places that I was inspired by as we were working through, so for the podcast we do Seriously Wrong, co-host Aaron and myself, we've been developing and sort of working on synthesizing good ideas around this concept of library socialism. So I was inspired by this book, Inventing the Future, where they talk about the need to build a leftist counter-hegemony, which is a set of ideas that can become an alternative common sense that help people to sort of envision the future that they want to be a part of, and then also envision what they're going to be doing in their day-to-day. So in that book, they propose, an agenda of basic income, full automation, and a world without work, in the sense that we usually think of work like with bosses, paychecks, etc. So that idea of a counter-hegemony is something that really captured my imagination, and I'm also a big fan of social ecology, the school of thought. It's like an anarchist Marxist school of thought spearheaded by Murray Bookchin, and library socialism is sort of the result of playing with these ideas in a, dare I say, spectacularly dialectical way to try to come to a conclusion for what is an idea, what is a vision of a society that we'd actually want to live in, which we can then use to not only use as a way to create a glue between leftists and progressives to have a shared vision, a shared idea of where they want to go, but it's also something that's going to be appealing to our cousins, our aunts, our uncles, normal people who aren't super weirdly into politics, people who haven't even been told to Google Murray Bookchin or read State and Revolution or whatever. There's a lot of people who are in that category. And I think library socialism can reach out to them and make an impact. So I'll first give you the vision. The vision is this. People love going to the shopping mall. They love shopping. Shopping is fun for whatever reason, but I don't think the thing that people like about shopping is spending money. I think what they like is the social atmosphere, going to places, picking and choosing what they want, etc. And we often think of like the shopping mall experience and fully automated luxury communism as being opposites, that like under fully automated luxury communism, you're not going to be able to have the experience of shopping. But library socialism reminds us that actually libraries are basically the same experience as a shopping mall. It's basically the same experience of a bookstore except without the money, and you're promised to return it at the end. So our vision would be a society where everything that's currently so weak transformed into a lending library, and then we'd have a society our current concept of private property and replace it with what anthropologists would call a usufructian idea of property, which means property is held in common. You don't have the right to destroy property. You have the right to use it and get benefit from it. But if you're not using it, it's fair game for anyone else. So you can't hold on to things that you're not using, and you can't use the things that other people are holding on to. It's a very basic social idea of how we deal with name it. Another perfect example of the library to me is the Pirate Bay. I was the former leader of the Pirate Party of Canada, actually, an intellectual property abolition organization. So it's dear to my heart to think that the Pirate Bay is actually kind of an enormous library that's giving people access to things that they couldn't have before. So that's like the top level vision on library socialism, what we're trying to do. And I think philosophically, the vision is exciting to people. The vision can be exciting to even people who aren't deeply political, which is it's a mechanism to describe the way that a utopian society could function. But underneath the hood, philosophically, something important is happening here, which is that we have, sort of twin crises in our society. We've got the environmental crisis and the social crisis. We've got an environmental crisis where we're burning through our environment, using too many resources, producing things that don't need to exist. We've got a social crisis where there's stratification, inequality, and crucially, people not getting the things they need. So somehow we have this system where we produce too much things and then we don't have enough things to give to the people who need it. It's like a bizarre, you wouldn't expect that to be a problem that a society could have, but that's the situation we find ourselves in, and it's rooted in this idea of, very private property sense of property where you can just like destroy something because you own it. Oh, that's my dog, so I can euthanize it. That's a completely disgusting view of the world. Like, it doesn't make sense just because you own something that you can destroy it in a finite planet. So the ideological war of library socialism is asserting this sort of utopian future counter-hegemony and being ready for the moment when, because of crises, and we saw this happen with neoliberalism, with the stagflation crisis. And in the book Inventing the Future, they talk about this in detail, and I do recommend checking it out on how they think about and talk about counter-hegemony. But the neoliberal project originally started as this small group called the Mont Pérelin Society, and they were basically just like pontificating on what they thought the world should be like. And it wasn't until decades later, when the stagflation crisis happened, that there was this sort of solution in weight of a crisis, which was neoliberalism, which was then applied the world over. And so I propose that library socialism could be sort of the left's solution in weight of a crisis. It's a way to address both the climate crisis and the social crisis at the same time by changing the way that we relate to property and each other. So it essentially means that we can meet the demands of the harsh degrowthists and meet the wildly luxurious demands of the fully automated luxury communists at the same time without any contradiction or tension. Because if you're sharing things, it takes less resources to get people access to things. So I think there's a real sort of mechanistic, theoretical basis to library socialism as one of the essential things it would take to switch to a fully sort of utopian society. And also, we take an unabashedly utopian perspective, and this comes from a very social ecological framework, which is we think it's important when we're talking about what we do in our day-to-day lives for the purposes of actualizing left politics, that we have an idea of where we want to go. And the idea of where we want to go isn't a perfect blueprint that we're going to follow exactly and punish people who don't meet our standards or whatever. There's no person in 2020 who can figure out what the revolution that's going to come in 2060 is really going to look like. But what we can do is we can describe the type of world that we want to live in, what a world that was defined by the good would look like. And then through that framework, it helps evaluate where we're at in the present and what sort of steps we can take towards getting there. So that's sort of like the ideological war on one end of library socialism, is to find ways to sort of dialectically synthesize all of these conflicts within the left and create a space where we can agree on sort of what the priorities are and agree on what the mechanisms could be to switch to a more utopian society. And then there's also the organizing side. And the organizing side, I'll leave sort of open-ended right now. We can talk about it in the Q&A. But the heart of it is this idea of the ecology of tactics, which, ironically, although social ecology is one influence, they talk about ecology a lot, they never say ecology of tactics. And in Inventing the Future, where they almost never mention ecology at all, they say ecology of tactics. And it's just such a useful, powerful idea to think. So what the ecology of tactics means is you have a variety of different types of political participation, and they can all play off of each other in positive ways that basically benefit each other towards the end. So there's no single tactic that is going to move us forward in any way. And there's certainly tactics we can do that are bad or counterproductive or work against other people, or other groups, or the overall goal. But the purpose of the sort of ecology of tactics concept is to think about the complementarity of potential tactics and to think about how are the ways where, we think of these things in direct contradiction a lot of the time, like, oh, are you a political party person, or are you a union person, or are you an electoralism person, are you a grassroots person? And the library socialist perspective would say that, everyone has to be a grassroots person, first of all. Like, we need to build community organizations of mutual aid, and crucially, like, direct democracy. You want to make people feel part of things. So if there's anyone here who's old enough to participate in the Occupy Wall Street protests 10 years ago, or even older than that, the World Trade Organization stuff and other anarchist movements, if you have that experience of face-to-face direct democracy like I got during democracy or during Occupy, people get in a variety of different ways. Democracy sort of clicks in a different way. You're like, oh, wow, this is actually really powerful, talking to each other and having that experience. So what the library socialist perspective says is, it's not that there's no context in which electoral politics could ever be useful. It's that in order for electoral politics to be ultimately useful, to be something that is part of a revolutionary change, we need to have mass organizations that are directly democratic and mutual aid, and which function as a sort of propaganda of the deed in a positive sense, not in like the 1800s anarchist blowing things up sense, but in the sense of like showing people what a nice world could be like, showing people what a nice organization could be like. It's a way of bringing people into the process, showing people what it's like when their voice matters, and what it's like when they're listened to, and what it's like to be part of an organization where the decisions aren't made by a small group of unaccountable people you never see, but were actually made while you were there. So library socialism takes sort of a prefigurative perspective to this, but also doesn't want to take anything off the table. We could have a global Soviet-style revolution by some sort of crazy thing of history, but it's not going to happen because we plan it. It's not going to happen because we're like, oh, I thought about this so deeply. The way that we could succeed in that sort of thing is by having the institutions that are ready for the moment of crisis, having the solutions and weight of a moment of crisis. And crucially, these institutions work perfectly well under this society to do all sorts of wonderful things without a revolution. Because if you're going to do electoral politics and you're not going to have grassroots democracy connected to that at the local level, then you're going to create a cleavage between the elected and the people. So if we want to have any chance at surviving a revolution, because I'll remind you, revolutions take 8, 9, 10 years, and most of the time a lot of people die in a bunch of various ways. Sometimes it turns out for better, sometimes it turns out for worse. I'm not saying I'm against it. I'm just saying if we are going to face that at some point, some people think we will, some people think we won't, but what we need is institutions which can protect the vulnerable, can protect the disabled, the elderly, parents of young children and stuff like that. This is a time of civil unrest. This is a time of civil war, potentially. So to say, like, I'm going to have a revolution in the future by starting a reading group or a theory group or something, I think it's a bit naive unless you're building the institutions that are ready for that instance. But those institutions... So I think I take an influence from Öcalan on this in the Democratic Federation in Northern Syria, the Rojava Revolution. Öcalan says that democracy and electoral politics, democracy and the state, are directly contradictory with each other. It's almost impossible to have a party organization that's legitimately democratic because of all the different types of like power dynamics therein and stuff like that. It's complex to bring democracy to government in practice. So what Öcalan suggests is that we bring democracy to communities, then we use those bases of democracy to challenge the state to get certain things, to challenge the state for certain outcomes, and potentially in the long term to challenge the state altogether to, like supersede it. But also Öcalan says, we might live alongside these nation states for a couple hundred more years. Who knows? We'll see how it goes. It's not, the important part isn't people changing their titles and the chairs they sit in and stuff like that. It's actually building socialism in our communities, what David Graeber in the book Debt calls interpersonal communism, where if three of us go home and we make our own bowl of soup from all the ingredients, we're going to waste tons of time doing that. But if one person makes a pot of soup enough for everyone, the whole group saves a bunch of time. That's not just that's actually like a feature of the universe. It's a feature of the social universe that when we pool our resources, we can be greater than the sum of our parts if we work together. And so what Library Socialism proposes, on the largest level possible, can we have a society that functions as an enormous library instead of an enormous marketplace? Can we have deliberative relations between people within politics and communities rather than relations in politics and communities that are based on either consumption of the explicit sense or the kind of like pseudo-consumption of voting and picking your favorite colored hat team or whatever, which is like Modibo Kadali, another great theorist, he calls social democracy the process of turning politics into commodity. So what I'd say when it comes to something like electoral politics or any strategy at all is like, let's not rule it out, but let's just hold it to really high standards. Is it directly democratic? Is it ecological? Is it decentralizing power? Is it horizontal? Does it function by a few people having authority over something, or is it a shared authority that's mediated through democratic engagement? Like, these are the questions that really matter on any tactic in any context, but I think especially when you deal with electoral politics, you're talking about the institutions of power and the capacity for, if not explicit corruption, the sort of like subtle corruption of the subtle corruption of like having low standards for what the government can do in government yourself, or low standards for yourself on what you would strive to do or what you would risk in order to try to achieve better ends. There's all sorts of like little weird I would call them corruptions, but it's not really fair. Like a lot of politicians are good people and they feel like they can't do things. But the way that we can fix that is like no matter what good person you put there, it needs to be backed up by a decentralized group of community decision makers who are engaged in directly democratic politics. That would be a legitimate type of electoral politics. If we don't do that, if we don't find ways to use the electoral mechanisms to do things like, I don't know, help people in the community who need help, then it's useless. And overall, I just say like the guiding star of library socialism in a lot of ways is this sort of idea of sweetie pie politics, that is being above board, like Matt mentioned before. And when I say above board, I just mean that we're going to face institutions that claim to be a certain way. And there's sometimes a temptation in our communities to approach those institutions as jaded already and say, oh, I know that these institutions can't work for people. And the strategy is sort of based around that presupposition as an original assumption. The sweetie pie perspective is that first you try, it's a process of trying, getting the reaction, trying, getting the reaction. So what that means is, I believe it's important for the first time we try anything to just show up, big-eyed and naive and like, we're trying to run for office, yeah. And then you get the experience of like why that's hard, why that's complicated, and that's what shapes people and pushes them forward. So that's one aspect of sweetie pie-ness, I think, is approaching things on their own terms to start and trying to be like taking people at their word. Like I take this institution at their word. I also agree that racism is bad, so I'm going to try to help this nonprofit deal with the issue of racism, for example. It's not to approach it saying like, oh, this is impossible, oh, this can never work, this NPO, blah, blah, blah. But through that experience, you figure out all the ways that that's sort of true, and then you're able to adjust your strategy. And the other part of sweetie pie-ness, I think, is an emphasis on the strategic, ethical in some way, but also the strategic importance of philosophical nonviolence as a group strategy. So that's not, when I say nonviolence, it's not that we don't disrupt things, and it's not that we're against the concept of people defending themselves abstractly, but it's when it comes to organizations who are doing public relations in terms of counter-hegemony and pushing an idea of library socialism. I think we can sort of walk the line there where we make clear both at the same time that our organization is committed to nonviolence as an organizing principle, and we think that we can restructure society without any violence, without any sort of thing like that, and that's our position. While at the same time, when it comes to incidences of actually existing violence, for example, when there's civil unrest, store windows are broken and stuff like that, the library socialist perspective, and I think even broadly the nonviolent perspective, nonviolence isn't a personal moral, like walking around like, I'm never going to be violent, I'm so pure. It's a strategic agenda taken by a group of people for achieving a specific purpose. And so within that, we can also defend incident by incident instances of types of violence if they are being served for a valid end. Like if something's being destroyed that could harm people, if statues are being taken down, people call that violence, property destruction and stuff. And actually, library socialists, we're sensitive to property destruction. We envision a society where no property is destroyed just because but we actually currently live under a system where the law says if you own property, you can just destroy it no matter what its value is, or no matter what value it could be to other people. So you have a situation where someone owns an empty condo and they have the right to destroy it while people are like on the streets elsewhere. It's a ridiculous situation. So there's a lot of like sub debates, and I'm imagining different objections and stuff like that on how we approach sweetie pie-ness in terms of library socialism, and how we approach the issue of like the ecology of tactics. So maybe what I'll do is I'll wrap up here and say that's sort of the vision of the ideological and organizing sides of library socialism as a tactic that I would advocate for the sort of Canadian left to pick up to a higher degree, and then we can open to questions, and I can try to take on any reasonable criticisms or questions about some of those specifics. I know that some of these are hot topics.
So I have a criticism. That was too good. Oh my God. There's so much to unpack there. I think, okay, so first question. So if you live in an apartment, where do you start?
Yeah, that is a good question. Well, it depends on, so I would look to see, oh, I mean, this is a big concept to me. I guess it could be considered a big concept of library socialism. Buckminster Fuller once said, "We don't fight forces, use them." So I think there's an extreme way to take that where you never fight any unjust force, and that's not what I'd advocate for. But generally speaking, if you can find places where forces are already moving in the right direction, and I think this clicks into library socialism really well, because you can see we have existing libraries in our communities funded by illegitimate states. And it's sort of like a weird contradiction in a way, but if you assume that there's some incompatibility there, but the library socialist perspective is bad money being spent on good things is good. When it comes to fighting forces, using them in your community, this is what I was trying to get at when it comes to living in an apartment. Is there a tenants union there? Are there other people in the building? Are there local organizations that deal with issues that you care about? So I think there's not really a necessity to say, oh, we're going to found this big library socialist organization that's going to overtake all the things that all these other organizations do, and we're going to strive to be the tenants union of the world, and we're going to strive to be this and that and this and that. Like there might be existing organizations that we can join into and then push sort of the utopian vision of library socialism within that, and also push some of the ethics that are connected to social ecological dual power, like Modibo Kadali speaks about. I always get his name wrong, but he also always gets Bookchin's name wrong, so I think it's fair. And I mean, talking to your neighbors is good, but you want to institutionalize it in some way. I should say try to find an existing institution, or try to work with others to find an institution that fills a niche that other people don't have. But a good place to start is having conversations, talking to your neighbors, seeing if people like what you're talking about, if people are tickled by the same utopian visions as you are, and they live geographically close to you. That is like a potent starting point for political organization, I think.
Awesome. And just on like the topic of institutions, like, do you see any that are just organically similarly aligned that it would be maybe the path of least resistant to engage with? Like, we've heard things about transit rider unions and things like that. Are there any like adjacent institutions that you think would be a good next step for somebody who's really compelled by these ideas?
Yeah, I mean, if you're really compelled to the ideas of a moral economy based on sharing and non-markets that uses the principles of libraries, I think there's probably organizations around many existing library institutions that there's places for like citizen participation and expansion of libraries. Some existing libraries already do stuff like tool libraries, stuff like that. There's also community-run tool libraries in some instances. So that'd be worth studying, whether there's stuff like that near you, or whether you're capable of getting together with other people and starting that sort of thing in your neighborhood. Another example that comes to mind actually is like if you live with roommates, it's there's challenges that come with that, but there's also naturally occurring library style relations that come with that. You share a TV, you share various things, you share the kitchen. So is there ways to think about scaling that up in communities and in groups of people who find ways to share things together under this system to save themselves money, save the earth resources, and try creating new ways of relating to each other and relating to property? Because another thing I'll just mention is a key point, and I think this is a point I originally got from Graeber, but it's something that really sort of blew my mind, which is we think of property as like, okay, I've got this book. Property is a relationship between me and this book. That's not actually true. property is a relationship between me and you and everyone else in relation to this book, because I'm saying that I'm in charge of it. Like, this is mine. If you take it from me, that's unjust. So basically, my point in saying that is that property, as we think of it, is already a relationship between people. So we just need to tweak that relationship so it actually works for people on the planet. When it comes to stuff like tenants unions, bus riders unions, workplace unions, all that stuff is extremely based in pilled, in my view, at its best. But it's also worth noting, I guess, that names of things don't always reflect what they are, and it could be also the same for like a community tool library and stuff like that. There's a lot of variation within that. There's more or less legitimate ways to do it. It's not just form, but it's also content. So how do we bring the contents of ecological, direct democratic, usufructian property relations ethics to the organizations that we're a part of? Because there's often, under capitalism, bizarre incentives to, say, like take grants from the province or the state or whatever in a way that is going to help you be able to hire someone, but then it's going to limit your ability to make free decisions or antagonize the state later and stuff like that. So all unions, organizations, local nonprofits, all of them deal with this stuff, and all of them come to different levels on it. So I just say that's something to look out for when you're getting involved with organizations, because, like, I wish I could say that all transit rider unions would be inherently good, and it's probably true that they are all mostly good anyways, but there's potential for there's inherent potential for abuse in organizations where decisions are made by small groups of people, where power is not decentralized, where there isn't horizontal relations amongst the members. So I'm not saying you shouldn't be part of an organization that's like that. I'm just saying it's something that we should keep in mind, and it's something that we should push for higher frontiers on in anything that we're part of. And we might also have to accept that, this organization or that organization isn't actually the right fit for us, even though it's geographically close and seems like it would be good.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of ties well into next question, which is, Canada, we're pretty geographically distant, and it can be a lonely experience for a lot of people. How would you suggest that we might be able to share with each other when that geography is not conducive to such a thing?
Yeah, it's a challenging thing on the Canadian left, having smaller population density overall and having that population density so far spread out. If I could give a vision for the future, a utopian future, I think that, Canada, America, every landmass with people should basically have this, but I think Canada should have a big ecological train that goes across Canada. I think people would really like that. I think also just I'll just throw it out there if there's anyone watching who's involved with like the NDP or Green Party Brain Trust or whatever. But I think if you say, oh, we're going to build a big ass train across Canada, it's going to be an ecological train that's going to help you see your family and stuff like that, I think that's got like Joe Sixpack appeal. I think that you can go to like rural Saskatchewan and people will be like, yeah, we want the big train. So again, both form and content matters, and trains can be ecologically devastating. They can be done at the expense of Indigenous peoples. Like, there's a bunch of different ways it can go wrong, but we need to be able to have those sort of visions of how we can connect our society at the same time, and we need to. So, yeah, and it's not to say that we shouldn't address those concerns. We should only do a train if we do address those concerns. But in terms of a vision for society as a whole and Canadian society, I think we should push a vision of a connected, a geographically connected transportation system, and free public transit. All that sort of stuff is the way to go, in terms of how we talk about it, at least. For organizing, we got to figure out ways to do this online. Including like face-to-face democracy online. I think it's something we need to do, but it's a challenge. It's definitely a much bigger challenge than, say, like a small European country where it's a half-hour drive to the other coast. Yeah,
one of the comments here says, "Oh, sweet, we're talking about like communist malls." And I like that sentiment in a way. I do wonder, though, like, speaking about the online tools and whatnot, is there anything that you've seen out there as as a practical tool that like you think has some potential behind it to help enable these visions come to life?
Yeah, well, I think we're getting better and better at every component part of making this work. If we're talking about a a communal from each according to their ability to each according to their needs society that has malls and something like Amazon and all that stuff. The private sector as it exists is figuring out all these weird systems for managing their internal. There's this great book on it, The People's Republic of Walmart, where they talk about how some of the centralization of stuff like Walmart and Amazon could be pivoted towards like a socialist society. Um, Another thing that I mentioned before, but the Pirate Bay and the internet itself, I think, is still being slept on in a big way about what this politically means to live in this moment. We live in a time in history where there's 7.5 billion of us. 6.5 billion of us are connected to the same network. We have access to all information that theoretically could exist. So, like right now in practice, we've got limited to a finite amount of that infinite information. But if we loosen intellectual property laws and we change the way that we thought of the internet, we could actually make it so that the phone that's already in our pocket, the screens that are already in our house, would connect to the total sum of all human knowledge throughout history. Um, we're close to that, even though it's illegal. So that's a massive technological innovation that I think isn't still being recognized for what it means for a socialist society. Um, yeah, and the I think that's the best example I can give. I'll hand it back.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. I guess like touching on the next thing, like one of the comments, it said in jest, but oh no, not social interaction. You're pretty active in organizing and have a pretty decent following of people absolutely in love with how you articulate yourself. How would you recommend for us, average people, going out there trying to talk to average people? How do we advance this vision and also try to get over that social anxiety and fear just of talking to somebody else about something new?
Yeah, it's challenging to push your own comfort zone. What always helps me push my comfort zone is when I think about what my goal is, and what the purpose of it is. So I think the people here probably, in their heart, have a real burning sense of passion for what's wrong with the world and the way that people are degraded by the world that we live in. And they probably have wounds from this world themselves that they feel. So I think centering and this process can be used for good or evil. So I'll just warn that ahead of time because we're talking about how to rewrite your own intuitions. Because if your intuition is saying it's rude to talk to a stranger, it actually, in most contexts, is a pretty good intuition. It's a pro-social intuition. But when you're talking about the need to radically transform society in 10 years, like we need to get our shit together in 10 years. There's a need to cross that boundary. So remembering what you're looking for in the end, what the goal is, and remembering that the people that you're talking to can benefit from what you're talking about. And I think when we're talking about the ultimate vision of a democratic, ecological, library socialist society, we're always going to be everyone you're talking to will benefit from that. Even like the most rich, even the most powerful people in this society, they're actually degraded. Like just a archetypical example is the slaveholder's humanity is degraded by the fact that they own slaves. They're less of a full person. They're not achieving their moral. They're alienating themselves. They're part of this horrible system. It's bad to be on the beneficial side of an unjust relationship too. And the people at the top are being deprived of things that everyone deserves, like real community, like having what they say matter, like not being part of systems that are insane bureaucracies that remove all their agency and give them limited choices between God. Like there's a bunch of different examples where you have all these tiny little inconsequential choices. And the alternative is a society where we talk to each other and what we say matters. And that's something that everyone deserves. That's something that Jeff Bezos deserves and doesn't have. Like he deserves to be part of a system where his say is proportionate, not disproportionate. If his say on the system is disproportionate, he's actually dehumanized by it because the responsibility that he has is too great for any person. So I would keep that in mind. What you're saying is best for everyone, and trying to keep what you're saying in that mindset, which is like you're trying to help a stranger realize their own best interests. Sometimes it's going to be uncomfortable, but if you really believe what you're talking about and you meditate on it, you meditate why that's important, then you should be able to overcome that with time. I'd also just recommend, maybe I'll get some heat for it, but I'd recommend volunteering for like electoral campaigns to get practice talking to strangers, going to doors and stuff like that, like outside of a pandemic. I've got a lot of critiques of any existing political party that is around. But when you have campaigns where it will be good for you or the world around you if one particular person edged out the other particular person and you have the time to do it, they'll train you on the basics of it and you can get some practice doing it. And it's not towards ultimate revolutionary ends or anything like that. And they're actually going to train you in some ways that you're going to have to unlearn later when it comes to connecting with people, because electoral politics is very much like talking, like, hey, are you going to support so-and-so? No? Okay, bye. Oh, you are? Great. Okay, I'm writing you. We're going to call you. Like that's basically all you do. But you're building up a capacity to feel worthy of talking to strangers. Because politics is important. So I recommend it. It's part of where it's the electoral politics sphere is really where I learned how to feel like it's okay to bother someone.
Yeah. Well, very well said. I think, like broadly speaking, electoral politics is something a lot on the left that really celebrate. But like you said, there's a lot of value there in gaining experience and building up your own skill set. So yeah, it's definitely encouraged with that lens. No, it's such a dense topic. I wonder, when you say that you could see there being criticisms and whatnot, I mean, what do you think is the biggest hurdle in seeing this vision come to fruition?
Well, it's so I mean, we live in a system that is designed to preclude democratic engagement almost at every step of the way. Like the structures of our society were designed in a context where they were systematically excluding the voices of women, indigenous people, people of color, etc. And those poor white people. There's like the whole history of these institutions. And again, this is something Graeber points out in the Democracy Project. We live under oligarchy that rebranded as democracy about 150 years ago, 200 years ago, because the word democracy was popular. But by the actual, like, say, founding fathers of America, or the founding fathers of Canada, whatever equivalent exists of that, these people saw democracy as an anarchistic, like, wild, you're going to prevent democracy at all costs. And they saw the oligarchies that we ended up settling on with the Canadian parliamentary system and the American electoral college and all the different varieties of it around the world. They're like, this is it. It's the perfect compromise between rule by the rich and the wild ravings of the people. So understanding that we live in a society that's fundamentally designed for like literal rule by the rich structurally, I think that's probably like numero uno. The power structures that are making decisions in society writ large right now are usually unaccountable, small, unelected polyarchies. And so polyarchy is in between a monarchy and a democracy. It's ruled by a small group of people. Our entire society is built on polyarchies. And it's usually built on shadow polyarchies that don't even explain who they are or what makes their decisions or who actually decides it. It's often obstructed through things like there's various ways of hiding the actual power structure of organizations. And if you're involved in like political organization a while, you start to see the shapes of real power structure, which is not written anywhere. So combining all that knowledge with the fact that we've got a very, very short timeline, all things considered, for dealing with the ecological crisis, and we have a sort of dominant ideology that says that there's going to be a technological quick fix where we don't have to change the way we relate to each other. We just need to keep on doing what we're doing. It's essentially like expecting Silicon Valley to bail us out of the ecological crisis is like humanity's receiving this enormous inheritance of money from our ancestors to like keep our house together, and then we're spending it all on lottery tickets. So that's, I think, that interconnected, all those little shitty things there is probably our number one thing to overcome, like in the world. Within the left, the thing to overcome, I think, is the connection between cruelty and community, and the connection between power and cruelty, I think, needs to be explored a little more. It's easy when you're big to be cruel by accident. It's easy to accidentally, this is a metaphor that comes from an acid trip I had once. It's easy to step on frogs by accident when you're big. And we see that on Twitter, where there's very powerful people who have very big influence who feel small, and because they feel small, they inflict harm. And we also have a community, because cruelty is also a way that we can bond as communities sometimes, where we have a shared enemy. Like, who doesn't love knowing that Trump got coronavirus? But that tendency towards cruelty, and the tendency towards cruelty, passive cruelty and power, the way these things sort of interplay with each other in organizations, but also in informal communities, it's something I think that we should all be really, really aware of, and I think that's something we should be willing to feel guilty about participating in when we do, and we should try to remember what Mr. Rogers would do. Like, we should try to remember that we're dealing with the walking wounded. We're dealing with people who, all of us, have chunks of us taken out by the system. And now that doesn't mean that we should overly stand up for ideological enemies that we don't just disagree with, but they're actually calling for harm or something like that. And I'm not trying to police people, how they feel, their catharsis and stuff like that. But I do think one of the big issues that we have to deal with internally in the left is sort of unpacking how these dynamics play into each other, and how these dynamics also play into senses of democracy being illegitimate, that people's voices being illegitimate, coming up with leftist woke reasons to disregard people's voices, which again, like, I come from the understanding that everyone deserves to be heard, and that everyone deserves to have their point of view listened to and integrated and be part of things. And so I think there's certain tendencies within the left that come out of completely understandable places in many cases, come out of not realizing your privilege or type of privilege often, or come from looking to have a sense of community in a world that's very hostile. But I think that a lot of these dynamics, unless we can pop the hood on them and figure out what makes them function and figure out how we can be good to each other, I think that's the biggest risk that we have of not pulling this off internally.
Yeah, beautifully said. It's really interesting. That is a common topic that's been emerging throughout almost everyone, is just making space to listen and recognize everyone has a history, and just being kind. So, no, very well said, as always. The next question, and maybe this will be the last question, then we can do your final thoughts. So it is, community organizations can lead to NIMBYism. How do we build interdependence and broad respect for broad humanitarian goals across these smaller mutual aid groups?
Yeah, here, let me just think about, because there's part I want to unpack and there's part I want to address directly. So how do we make local groups have a global scale? Part of that is that we want to create institutions of confederation. So smaller groups in local levels working together on regional projects, and then having those confederations of smaller groups start confederating amongst themselves. where the power comes from the bottom up, and the higher the higher bodies are ways of either implementing ideas, sending back specific suggestions down to be, ratified by the smaller levels and stuff like that. But I think we live, so that broadly, like, that's the mechanism that we'd propose creating for direct democracy, for how to deal with this, like how to square that circle. But I think we also live in a society that is too global to stop. As leftists who are trying to build this, our big concern should be the local, not because the international isn't important, but because the local is what we can have power over imminently. The municipal and local level is often neglected comparatively. Like, everyone's paying attention to what's going on in America on Twitter. So there's no issue with making people understand they live in the world. I think the technological age we're in really is going to make sure that the planet is in everyone's mind. So I think our big concern is making those organizations, those democratic organizations, locally, and then working towards those ends. And I imagine we'll encounter problems as we go, and we have to troubleshoot them. But I've got a lot of faith in the ingenuity of human beings to overcome that type of thing. And I really think there isn't any other game in town other than finding ways to listen to people. If direct democracy will be a challenge, it'll be a challenge like space flight was. It will be a challenge like learning to do your own dishes when you first moved out is a challenge. But we can overcome that stuff. The thing I really want to unpack is the idea that local organizations create NIMBYism, because I think NIMBYism comes from. So I think there's a real issue when people are saying, I don't want social housing in my backyard, I don't want safe injection sites in my backyard and stuff like that. But again, it's a form and content confusion, because everyone should be IDIMBY, it depends in my backyard. I want some things, but I don't want other things, because presumably everyone is okay with having something in their backyard. But the real point here is I don't actually think that local organizations create NIMBYism. I think NIMBYism is a word that we have for types of conservatism that are expressed through a false local concern, a localism that's parochial, that doesn't look beyond the end of its own nose. It's a type of conservatism. Because I don't like the NIMBY frame too, because it's really pushed by the people who identify as YIMBYs, the yes in my backyard, but it has the same problem. Yes, what in your backyard? Because yes, social housing should be in everyone's backyard. Free transit should be in everyone's backyard. Safe injection sites, hospitals, there's all sorts of stuff that should go in your metaphorical backyard. But condos? Yes in my backyard to condos? Yes in my backyard to a statue of someone or something? What a weird... If we're just going to focus on form and not content, chaotic way to view the world. So anyway, not to the person who mentioned this isn't buying into this. They are. But what I'm saying is I don't think that local organizations actually create NIMBYism. I think what we need to do is create means of democratic discussion and mediation, that mass organization that can include conservative points of view, and help mediate them through group processes and bring out latent possibilities. So when you talk to someone who's like, oh, we let in too many immigrants, but we don't house our veterans. Okay. Frustrating. Very frustrating. I'm upset with this guy. I actually think he doesn't understand the immigration issue. I think he doesn't understand the veterans issue. But there's a revolutionary spark in there. He wants to house someone. And it's like, through the democratic process, having groups of people having these conversations together, where you put that guy in a group of other people who also care about housing, who also want to talk about their community, and the process of dialectical reason, the dialogue between people, helps bring out humanity in each other. I really, my experience of it is that, and I think that's just the case. So we need to find ways to engage NIMBYs on what really matters to them, and in some cases we can help them recognize that they're not saying what they think they're saying. We can try to engage them on dialogue and stuff like that, but I don't think avoiding local modes of organization is a way to solve that particular problem. These people who have a misunderstanding, have sets of misunderstandings, and don't want progressive policy implemented in their neighborhood. So, yeah, and there's a lot of nuance that I didn't have time to get into there. But that's my hot take on NIMBYs.
Excellent. So we are running to the end of time here. Did you have any thoughts of how you would like to wrap it up with your final thoughts on library socialism?
Yeah, I would just say, so I don't, I think that this is something that Aaron and my co-host on Seriously Wrong and I have it's a collection of ideas we've stumbled onto, this constellation of all these different things through the process of dialogue and research over the course of like 6 years. There's tons of influences on this set of ideas I didn't have time to mention. But I guess I bring this collection of ideas to you all humbly to say, I really think as best as I can, and when I think about all this, like, and I thought about this stuff a lot. I've been involved in politics to some degree for a while. I feel like I can safely say that. I'm pretty involved. I've thought about this a lot. I've tried to think about alternatives. And I think this is the only game in town. I think finding ways to do direct democracy and finding ways to share abundance with each other, to have a society of circulating abundance that turns the world into a library instead of a marketplace, is our best shot at surviving the next 1,000 years as a species. It is the actualization of the potentials within us that are worth celebrating, affirmed into a political vision that can help resolve, I think, a lot of the intra-left problems that we have today, by providing a shared framework where we can discuss things in terms of a shared vision of a society that we want to create and what it would be like. And yeah, I think I think it's a great idea. I wouldn't be here wasting your time with this if I didn't think that this was not just like a good idea, but like the best thing that I've been able to come up with yet after the work that I put in. So I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope that it gave you something to think about. And whether or not I don't really understand exactly what's going to make people decide who wins or not. But if you do vote for library socialism and you do want to organize around it, I really appreciate that, and I appreciate your time and attention here today to listen to my thoughts on these interconnected issues. And definitely feel free to check out my podcast. We get into this a little bit more, and we also just got a new series out about social ecology, which is one of the big influences on this.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think it is such an exciting concept for so many reasons. I think right now the world's on fire and everything's falling apart. And then you look at what's happened with some of these like big capitalist groups, like even Walmart, where they're going out of business. What's happening to reclaim that land and those buildings? They're becoming big libraries. I think libraries are the future, and I'm very excited.
Creative reinterpretation. We're going to, if we succeed and we have a new society, the first order of business is going to be creatively reinterpreting what's been left behind from this one.
Exciting. That's so exciting. Shawn, thank you so very much. I'm very honored and privileged to enjoy your time with us here today. Enjoy
it was
the
a
rest
pleasure.
of your evening, sir.
Likewise.